The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. High in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the peaks kissed the clouds, Elias Kane lived alone in a cabin he'd built with his own hands. The world below felt distant, a memory of noise and haste he'd left behind. His days were simple: chop wood, tend the garden, hunt for game. But winter was coming, and the solitude, once a comfort, had begun to feel heavy. Elias was a man of few words, his face weathered like the bark of the oaks around him, his heart guarded by years of quiet. He needed help. His hands, though strong, couldn't keep up with the chores alone, not with the cold creeping closer. Cooking, especially, had become a burden. His stews were bland, his bread hard as stone. So, he rode down to the valley, to the small town of Willow Creek, and pinned a notice to the board outside the general store: "Mountain Man seeks cook. Room and board provided. Fair pay." He didn't expect much. The townsfolk thought him odd, a hermit who rarely spoke. But Elias didn't care for their opinions. He just wanted someone to ease the weight of his days. Weeks passed, and no one answered. Then, one crisp morning, a letter arrived, delivered by the storekeeper's boy. It was written in careful, looping script: "My name is Clara Wren. I am with child and recently widowed. I can cook and keep a house. I seek a safe place for me and my unborn. I will work hard." Elias read the letter twice, his brow furrowing. A pregnant widow. He hadn't planned on that. But the words, "work hard," stuck with him. He needed help, and she needed a home. He sent word back: "Come." Clara arrived on a gray afternoon, her small figure bundled in a worn shawl, her belly round beneath it. She stepped off the wagon with a single bag, her face pale but her eyes steady, like the surface of a still lake. Elias met her at the edge of his land, where the path met the forest. He nodded, unsure of words, and led her to the cabin. It was sturdy but plain: log walls, a stone hearth, a single window letting in slants of light. Clara looked around, her hands clasped over her stomach, and said softly, "It's peaceful here." Elias showed her the kitchen, a small corner with a wood stove, a table, and shelves of mismatched jars. "Cook what you can," he said. "I eat simple." Clara nodded, her lips curving just enough to hint at a smile. That evening, she made cornbread and a stew of venison and root vegetables. The smell filled the cabin, warm and rich, like a memory Elias couldn't quite place. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. The food was good, better than anything he'd managed. He nodded his thanks, and Clara cleared the plates without a word. Days turned to weeks. Clara settled into a rhythm. She rose early, her steps light despite her growing belly, and filled the cabin with the scents of bread, soup, and roasted herbs. Elias watched her quietly, noting the care she took, how she swept the floor until it gleamed, how she mended his torn shirts without being asked. But there was a sadness in her, too, in the way her hands lingered on her stomach, in the faraway look she got when she thought he wasn't watching. Elias didn't ask about her past. He figured it wasn't his business. Still, the weight of her grief seemed to settle in the cabin, mingling with his own. One evening, as snow dusted the ground outside, Clara set a plate of biscuits and rabbit stew before him. The firelight caught her face, and Elias noticed a tear slip down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly, but he saw. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff from disuse. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Just thinking of my husband, Thomas. He loved biscuits. Said they reminded him of his ma." Her voice was soft, like she was speaking to the fire. Elias didn't know what to say. He'd never been good with words, especially not about feelings. He grunted and took a bite, the biscuit warm and flaky. "Good," he said. Clara's lips twitched, almost a smile, and she turned back to the stove. The problem wasn't the cooking. Clara was more than capable, her meals a quiet gift in the cold days. The problem was the silence between them, not the comfortable kind Elias was used to, but a heavier one, filled with unspoken things. He'd hired her to cook, to keep his life simple, but her presence stirred something in him. He found himself noticing her small kindnesses, how she left wildflowers in a jar on the table, how she hummed softly while kneading dough. It made him uneasy, like the ground beneath him was shifting. One morning, as Clara chopped carrots by the window, she winced and pressed a hand to her side. Elias, splitting wood outside, saw through the glass. He dropped his axe and stepped inside. "You hurt?" he asked. "Just the baby kicking," she said, her voice tight but calm. "He's strong." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Elias nodded, lingering a moment longer than he meant to. He realized then that he didn't just want her to cook. He wanted her to be safe, to be at peace. And that thought scared him. He'd lived alone too long to know how to care for someone else. The twist came slowly, not in a single moment but in the quiet days that followed. Clara began to talk more, her words like soft rain after a drought. She spoke of Thomas, how he'd been a carpenter, how he'd promised to build a cradle before he fell ill. She spoke of her fears for the baby, of raising a child alone. Elias listened, his hands still on his work, his heart opening despite himself. He didn't know how to comfort her, but he found himself wanting to try. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Clara sat by the fire, mending a quilt. Elias watched her, the needle moving in steady, graceful stitches. "You're good at that," he said. "My mother taught me," Clara replied. "She said a stitch can hold a life together, if you do it with care." She paused, her hands still. "Elias, why do you live up here alone?" The question caught him off guard. He stared into the fire, the logs popping softly. "Lost my family years ago," he said finally. "Wife, son, fever took 'em. Town felt too loud after that. Up here, it's quiet. I can think." Clara nodded, her eyes soft. "I understand," she said. "But quiet can be heavy, too." Her words stayed with him. The next day, he found himself in the shed, pulling out old tools he hadn't touched in years. He didn't plan it, not really, but he started carving. The wood was cedar, fragrant and smooth, and his hands remembered the craft he'd abandoned after his loss. He worked slowly, shaping curves and slats, sanding until the wood gleamed. Clara noticed but didn't ask, and he didn't explain. Winter deepened, the snow piling high around the cabin. Clara's time grew near, her movements slower, her face tired but serene. One night, as a storm rattled the windows, she gasped and clutched the table. Elias was at her side in an instant. "It's time," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. He helped her to the bed, piling blankets around her, and rode through the snow to fetch the midwife from Willow Creek. The hours that followed were long, the wind howling as if the mountain itself held its breath. Elias waited by the fire, his hands clenched, listening to Clara's soft cries. When the midwife finally called him in, he saw Clara holding a tiny bundle, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. "It's a boy," she said. "I'm naming him Thomas." Elias nodded, his throat tight. He looked at the child, so small and fragile, and felt something crack open inside him, a warmth he hadn't known in years. The next day, he brought the cedar cradle into the cabin. It was simple but sturdy, polished to a soft shine. Clara's eyes widened when she saw it. "You made this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For the boy," Elias said, looking away. "Thought he'd need it." Clara reached out, her hand resting on his arm. "Thank you, Elias," she said. "Not just for this, for everything." The days that followed were softer, lighter. Clara recovered slowly, and Elias took on more chores, chopping extra wood, fetching water, even warming bottles for little Thomas. The cabin felt different now, filled with the sounds of a baby's coos and Clara's gentle humming. Elias found himself lingering at the table after meals, listening to Clara's stories, sharing a few of his own. He told her about his son, how he'd loved to chase fireflies, how his laugh had been the brightest thing in the world. Clara listened, her eyes kind, and Elias felt the weight of his grief ease, just a little. Spring came, the snow melting into streams that sparkled in the sun. Clara and Thomas would stay, she said, at least until she could stand on her own. But Elias hoped they wouldn't leave. The cabin, once a place to hide, had become a home again. Clara had taught him more than he'd expected, not just how to season a stew or mend a shirt, but how to let grace into his life. Her quiet strength, Her care, her resilience, they'd shown him that solitude didn't have to mean loneliness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks, Elias sat on the porch with Clara, Thomas asleep in her arms. The air was warm, scented with pine and promise. "You've made this place better," Elias said, his voice low. "You and the boy," Clara smiled, her eyes catching the last light. "You gave us a home, Elias. That's no small thing." He nodded, his heart full. The mountain stretched out before them, vast and quiet, but no longer heavy. Together, they watched the stars begin to appear, one by one, in the deepening sky.